Welcome everyone to our Crime Craft for June. We're so happy to have Art Taylor here. I'm going to start with a couple of housekeeping announcements. Then I'm going to hand over to our program chair, Kate Hall. She will do the intro and the interview, and we have some slides, and then there's a Q&A at the end. So do put your questions into the chat or jot them down, and we'll be happy to take them. So MWA, as you know, we've got a lot going on. We always have a lot going on. We have the Burstein Award. The Leon Burstein Award is an annual contest run by our chapter. So it's a very small group. Chances of winning are high. But we do require 20 pages of your completed manuscript to be submitted by mid-July. And then finalists are required to submit their entire manuscript, I think in early September. And then the award is given out in November this year at Revels. So if you have a manuscript, you're an unpublished writer, do dust it off, prep the first 20 pages and submit. The submissions are only open for 6 weeks, ending the middle of July. We also have Revels this time is in November, trying to pin down the place that we are going to meet at, and it's always in Manhattan. So look for that announcement in a bit. And lastly, local groups are taking off. We have 28 local groups within our chapter because it's such a big chapter. But do get in touch with Carol at localgroups@MWA-NY.org if you would like to meet local people, local members, maybe come up with your own critique group, whatever you'd like to do. There's an opportunity there to form groups all over the tri-state area. We have actually got 5 or 6 states that are part of our chapter. So if you'd like to meet up with someone local that's in our chapter, another member, partner on something, or just trade stories, you're welcome to do that. Just email localgroups@mwany.org, and Carol will set you up and create that group for you. Okay, that's it on the housekeeping announcements. I'm going to hand over to Kate Hall, who is our wonderful program chair and has gotten such a great lineup for us. Every single meeting has been so well attended and has been so interesting. So take it away, Kate.
Thanks, Nev. So I just want to start out by saying congratulations to Art. Today, they announced the Macavity Awards, and his story, Two for One, is nominated for a Macavity Award. So congratulations, Art.
Thank you.
Art Taylor is the Edgar Award-winning author of 2 collections, The Adventure of the Castle Thief and Other Expeditions and Indiscretions, and The Boy Detective in the Summer of '74 and Other Tales of Suspense. His debut book, On the Road with Del and Louise, A Novel and Stories, won the Agatha Award for Best First Novel. His short fiction has also won the Agatha, Anthony, Derringer, and Macavity Awards, and he was the 2025 recipient of the Short Mystery Fiction Society's Golden Derringer for Lifetime Achievement. He is a professor of English at George Mason University, and you can find him online at www.arttaylorwriter.com. And I'll put that in the chat. Again, so welcome, Art. You're going to be talking about the first 2 pages today. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. And at the end of Art's presentation, I'll read out some of the questions and we'll hopefully get them answered. So thank you so much, Art. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Kate, and I appreciate being here. And it's nice to see so many folks that I know. I see Vicky, I see Jeff, I see Al, I see Jim, I see Nev, I see some other people, and I'm sure iPhone 293. I mean, know you well, so we'll see. I'm going to share my PowerPoint real quick, and there's some text I want to look at. I have admittedly gone through some of these texts. If you've been to some of my talks for Sisters in Crime, for example, you probably recognize maybe some of the text I'm talking about. But I'm hoping to put some different focus on it. I got a new text as well to look at. I'm trying to make sure I can get the chat up here as well. And I'll try to answer some questions at the end. If something seems urgent, I will come back to it, or come to it quickly and then come back to it later. Let me see if this is working. Okay. I did want to start out by talking about Bonnie Stevens. Some of you may know B.K. Stevens, Bonnie Stevens. She was a frequent contributor to Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, and she actually is the one who founded the blog, The First Two Pages, which I took over, it's hard to believe, in 2017. She started in 2015 as a place specifically for short story writers to write about how they're capturing the attention of their reader, how they're laying the foundation for a work in those first two pages. Bonnie died in 2017, and her family asked me to take it over. So I always feel like I'm a curator of the blog more than anything else, and I wanted to give a shout out to her. Bonnie was the author, and if I'm open on that, of her Infinite Variety. So I'll give a shout out for her short story collection, because a lot of her stories are also models for how the first two pages should be done to maximum effect. I'm not going to read always everything that's on the PowerPoint. You can read that for yourself. This gets a little bit to Bonnie's mission statement there. I want to pop ahead and talk about a little bit of the conventional wisdom. I'm sure most of you have heard all of this, or parts of it at least. Kurt Vonnegut talking about starting close to the end of a story as possible. Get that conflict condensed as much as you can. Chekhov famously said, tear up the first 3 pages of a manuscript. I actually find that very useful. A lot of times I'm trying to figure out my way into a story. Get rid of that and find the way to fold whatever information you need somewhere else in there. Everybody knows Elmore Leonard's 10 rules. I do want to focus a little bit more on the first 5 pages. Kate and I were talking before everybody was joining about how well known this book is. I've got that book here as well, right there. The first 5 pages, A Writer's Guide to Staying Out of the Rejection Pile. He emphasized it should be titled The First 5 Sentences. And Kate and I were talking, it reminded me of a quote that I want to give about how high the stakes are. We often think about catching a reader's attention, but it's also an editor's attention. And Lukeman's advice isn't just about starting with a bang or in the middle of the action or whatever, which I think most of us think about. How can I start with a body, given a murder mystery, a body on the page? How can I start with something really active, with urgency? But it's also about prose and style, about form as content. And as I said, convincing an editor as well as a reader that they're in good hands, the hands of a storyteller. I want to quote Lukeman real quick. He said his book assumes that by scrutinizing a few pages closely enough, particularly the first few, you can make a determination for the whole. It assumes that if you find one line of extraneous dialogue on page 1, you will likely find one line of extraneous dialogue on each page to come. So that's the kind of pressure that Lukeman's talking about from a prose level, not just about what's happening, but about the idea about, as a storyteller, how tight, how efficient, how effective, how focused are you? How much does the reader or the editor believe that you're going to be in good hands with them? One false note seems a lot, but that's the kind of thing we're looking at. Some lessons from the first 2 pages. One is that everybody works differently. You would think that if that's the goal, that focus, efficiency, and economy and effectiveness, that there would be some magic formula. But I find that from the contributors to the first 2 pages blog, a lot of people take different tacks, a lot of different ways to start a story, with dialogue, with narration, with some telling. What's interesting is that most of the writers with the first 2 pages blog, as they're reflecting on their work, they have not thought about the craft issues. I invite people to come into the blog and specifically tell them sometimes, this is the story that I'd like you to write about. Usually it's one that's just come up or one that's been nominated for an award or something like that. And so often as they write their analysis, their reflection on what they've created, they're like, I actually didn't think about any of these things explicitly. It was done intuitively, but they learned something from looking back at it. I've been in that situation myself, writing about my own work, things that I didn't plan out, but that seemed to work out well, and then trying to figure out why did they do that and how can I repeat that. Um, as it says here, generally the reflections are focused on several main points. How do you build that foundation for the story? Here's the story ahead, and I want to make sure that I lay out a lot of things for it. How do you foreshadow conflict, even if it's not introduced on that first page or first couple of pages? How do you get the seeds for the conflict going? And then, really, how do you get somebody to turn to the third page? That's the main thing. Pique that curiosity and interest. Get them invested in a character. Raise some questions that you want to answer. I want to focus on two specific essays, very briefly a little bit. One's by Bob Mangio. That's just from a story in Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine. And I will share the links to each of these essays and to a couple of other things that I'm talking about a little bit later. But as he says here, thinking about his first draft of his first 2 pages, it was perfect. The opening paragraph cut immediately to our hero, an extreme close-up of an illuminated manuscript as photographed for art history. The illustration was a knight on bended knee. You can read a lot of this here. He's like, this is the image I wanted. This is the voice I was going for. A nod to theme, backstory, a MacGuffin. It was perfect, except for the readers who then read it. And I hope all of you have beta readers or writing groups that you run your drafts by. He said, and they're all like, who's narrating? Why are they looking at this? What's going on? I appreciate that as well, because it says, even if we're trying to craft something that we think is working, it might not work for a reader. As he points out, in there, he said, it took hair pulling and forehead banging to shake loose. My friends were saying I hadn't framed the story, the who, what, when, where, why, grounding the reader journalistically and dramatically at the same time, I think is important. If your reader is struggling to figure out the basics, then they're not going to be able to focus on that higher level engagement that you want them to. We're going to look again at some specific passages later. I'm just laying the groundwork now for things. Another essay is Nick Kolakowski on A Nice Pair of Guns. And he talks in this. I always like the writers who say, I tried something first and it didn't work, and here's what I did instead, and here's why. And he fought some conventional wisdom with this. As he said, I made the mistake of opening in medias res at a moment of high tension and danger for the main character, a bounty hunter trying to recover a pair of assault rifles stolen from him by a local meth kingpin. What a great image to start with. But as he said, he knew something was wrong. I might have succeeded in grabbing the reader's attention at the outset, but the story as a whole felt profoundly unbalanced. You need to know the character before you can be invested in the danger the character feels. And he went back and wrote a slower opening. And we're going to talk about slow openings, slow beginnings a little bit more in just a minute. And I think that's really good to think about how you're pacing and how you're serving the story and serving the reader as you move along. We're going to look at some of that too. Main points ahead. I want to talk about laying several lines of action, and I'm going to go ahead and pull this up. I can't remember if I've got this on the screen, but that phrase comes from Patricia Highsmith's Plotting and Writing Suspense Fiction, which is the oddest craft book I believe I've ever read, but it's the one that I go back to as much as any other one. We're going to look at scene building. We're going to look at guns and ghosts and more. How's that for a maybe a little teaser? I want to look at conflict at the line level, the prose as well as the plot. And then we're going to look a little bit at endings, because one of the main things I found is there's this hinge, and that's the word Ben Percy uses, as I recall, in his book Thrill Me, which I also have, could also hold up. But the idea that the beginnings and endings are connected. If you're having trouble with your ending, we'll get to this in a little bit, having trouble with your ending, go back and interrogate your beginning. And often once you reach the end, you'll go back and rewrite the beginning to get that foundation ready, those seeds laid for where you're heading. Conflict at the plot level. This is one of the things we think about. If anybody does have questions that seem urgent, feel free to put them in the chat. I do have the chat up. And I'm going to go through this not too quickly. Yeah, I do have that picture up there. Patricia Highsmith, in Plotting and Writing Suspense Fiction, says, I like a slow beginning. I'm going to go back to B.K. Stevens, Bonnie Stevens. Bonnie and I wrote back-to-back essays, and after I'd turned mine in, this was in the first year that she hosted the blog. In the first year that we wrote back-to-back essays, both of us talking about how we liked slow beginnings as well. And this was before I had really looked at Patricia Highsmith's book. That's counterintuitive. Everybody says you got to start quick. You got to get stuff into action. Here's what she says at greater length about the lines of action that you can draw there. By lines of action, I mean lines of potential action, such as the desire of a character to make a trip somewhere, of another to quit the scene and his inability to do so, the desire of a character for something or someone he or she does not yet have, or the mention of potential danger. Thus, merely to describe characters' relationships can create a line of action, provided that the relationship is dynamic. A slow beginning, but you're laying the lines of action that you're then, and I'm going to extend this metaphor a little bit in ways that Highsmith doesn't, that you're then going to take those lines of action you laid and pull them tighter or twist them or cross them in some way so that that initial slow beginning, even if it is a slow beginning, has laid the opportunity for quick escalation and continual escalation of conflict. I want to look at a specific story. We don't think of this as a mystery story, but we've got a killer in here. We've got, spoiler alert, some killings, plural, in there. I think most people have possibly heard of this story and possibly read it. I want to look at the beginning here, and I will read this aloud as best I can. Let me see if I can clear up some screen here a little bit so I can see it. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee. This is Flannery O'Connor, if somebody does not know that. And she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the journal. Now, look here, Bailey, she said. See here, read this. And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida. And you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did. Bailey didn't look up from his reading, so she wheeled around then and faced the children's mother, a young woman in slacks, whose face was as broad and innocent as a cabbage and was tied around with a green handkerchief that had 2 points on it on top like rabbit's ears. She was sitting on the sofa feeding the baby his apricots out of a jar. The children have been to Florida before, the old lady said. You all ought to take them somewhere else for a change so they would see different parts of the world and be broad. They never have been to East Tennessee. The children's mother didn't seem to hear her, but the 8-year-old boy, John Wesley, a stocky child with glasses, said, if you don't want to go to Florida, why don't you stay at home? He and the little girl, June Starr, were reading the funny papers on the floor. She wouldn't stay at home to be queen for a day, June Starr said without raising her yellow head. Yes, and what would you do if this fella, the misfit, caught you? The grandmother asked. I'd smack his face, John Wesley said. I bring this up because I think we see the lines of action automatically. We see the grandmother's relationship with her son Bailey, even with a lack of response from Bailey or a lack of response from her daughter-in-law, we get a clear sense of what that relationship is, what those lines of action and potential action are. We've got the relationship between John Wesley and June Starr and the grandmother. We've got the desire, to go back to what Highsmith said, the desire of the grandmother to go to East Tennessee instead of going to Florida, and her trying to manipulate that. And then we've got another character here, needless to say, who's not in scene, but plays an important role. If we go back to what we talked about with Bob Mangio, the idea of laying the who, what, when, where, we get all that information laid out. All the major characters in the story are introduced, including the misfit. I'll come back to the misfit in a minute. We've got desires revealed, that line of action moving ahead. We've got some actions actually taken to achieve that desire. If somebody wants something, we want to see them taking action to get that something. And the grandmother, who's our protagonist here, for better or worse, is taking some action, big and small there. A lot of conflicts introduced, those lines of action, as I mentioned. And then how will the story end? I'm anticipating that most of you know the story, as I said, but whenever I ask in a workshop, a lit class, anytime I've talked about this story, how is it going to end? There's a couple of things that people know automatically. Number one, the misfit has to show up. No doubt, the misfit has to show up. And number two, that poor little boy who says I'd smack him in the face, he's not going to successfully smack him in the face. Now, even though we know those two things automatically, the family has to cross paths with the misfit. John Wesley will not successfully smack him in the face. What is going to happen? How is it going to play out? And what kind of twist are we going to have? I want to take a little bit of a detour here, and I hope I'm not going too quickly on this. I want to take a little bit of a detour here to talk about a couple of things that you probably also have heard. One is about Chekhov's gun. Remove everything has no relevance to the story. If you say in the first chapter there's a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or the third chapter it must go off. Usually they say act as well. Chapter works too. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. We all know about Chekhov's gun. I want to take this in a different direction. I want to give, and I should probably find the link for this as well. It's on the Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine blog. It's an essay called Chekhov for the Gunshot, which I think is just stupendous reading for anybody who has heard this Chekhov's gun before and wants to dive a little deeper on it. And what he does is he talks about what we've just done with the Flannery O'Connor story, the idea of a ghost plot. He said that the fictional narrative is not one story, but two. The first is the plot that it plays out as it plays out on the page. But the second is a ghost plot that consists of anticipated but unrealized events, a chain that otherwise exists in a state of continually evolving dialectic with the actual. I think I'm missing a word there. I'll have to go back and fix that. But what he's saying is that the reader on that first page or first two pages is already projecting ahead, as we just did, what's going to happen, what's not going to happen. We know we're going to meet the misfit. We know it's not going to go well. But how is that going to play out? I often ask in my classes, I teach at George Mason University. In my classes there, I often ask students when they're reading drafts by their peers to stop at the end of the first page, page and a half, two, where they feel like there's a little bit of a break, and to write down everything that they think might happen next or ahead, where they think the story's going, and just write that down. It doesn't matter whether they're ultimately right or not. In fact, I think it's best if they're not right, because it gives the author the chance to hear what the reader is anticipating, and then the writer can play toward or against some of that. Now, I think a smart writer is going to go ahead and brainstorm where they are manipulating the reader to go. And we're going to look at that in just a minute as well, so that then they can offer that twist at whatever level. George Saunders talks about Chekhov as well in a great book, Swim in a Pond in the Rain. I do have that over there. I won't hold it up. We got the cover here. The fundamental unit of storytelling is a two-part move. The writer creates an expectation and then responds to or uses or exploits or honors that set of expectations. We want to invest the reader in something, and then we want to twist those expectations in some way. I'm going to look back a little bit at Good Man is Hard to Find, and we've got those mentions there, that fellow that calls himself the misfit, loose from the federal pen. That's introduced. Danger is introduced. Trouble is introduced. And we want to make sure, the grandmother wants to make sure that we're not going anywhere near Florida to avoid. So we're going to go in another direction, and she's going to convince them to. No matter what direction you're going in, I think there's some fate, whether at the storytelling level or the plot level, they're going to end up there. And then the idea of what would you do if the fellow, the misfit, caught you. That's very, very smart to get that in. I want to look at another thing here. This is a story by Brees DJ Pancake, a West Virginia writer, published, I think it was 6 stories in the Atlantic. in his early 20s. It's a very sad story. His story, very, very promising writer, but he killed himself at age 26, and so his career's cut short. Considered like the best short story writer you don't know. I want to look at this one too, real quick, and I appreciate you letting me read through these openings. We're going to come back to them again and again. Mr. Weeks called me out again tonight, and I looked back down the hall of my house. I left the kitchen light burning. This is an empty old house since the old lady died. When Mr. Weeks doesn't call, I write everybody I know about my boy. Some of my letters always come back, and the folks who write back say nobody knows where he got off to. I can't help but think he might come home at night when I'm gone, so I let the kitchen light burn and go on out the door. The cold air is the same, and the snow pellets my cap. I love that verb. Sifts under my collar. I hear my hogs come grunting from their shed, thinking I've come to feed them. I ought to feed them better than that awful slop, but I can't until I know my boy is safe. I told him not to go and look, that the hogs just squeal because I never kill them. They always squeal when they're happy, but he went and looked, and then he ran off someplace. I brush the snow from my road plow's windshield and climb in. The vinyl seats are cold, but I like them. They are smooth and easy cleaned. The lug wrench is where it has always been beside my seat. I heft it, put it back. I start the salt spreader, lower my shear, and head out to clear the mountain road. There is a tremendous amount going on in 3 very short paragraphs here. We've got an entire cast of characters. We got Mr. Weeks. We got the old lady who's died. We got the son who has gone missing. There's a mystery there. What has happened, and that desire that he's got and the action he's taking to find his boy, to bring his boy back. Then we got the hogs, and those hogs are a motif that comes back again and again. I will share ultimately the full story here in a link for you to read on your own. I think it's worth studying. It's 1,700 words, a little over 1,700 words, and it packs a world into it. Reason I'm bringing it up here, though, is not just to say about how we're getting the who and the what and the where. We get the rural placement, even if we don't get West Virginia mentioned. We get rural, we get the cast of characters. We also get a Chekhov's gun here, and it's actually kind of a two-part Chekhov's gun. The vinyl seats are cold, but I like them. They are smooth and easy cleaned. The lug wrench is where it's always been, beside my seat. And if we miss that lug wrench, don't pay enough attention to it, he hefts it and puts it back. And that's the gun that, as you'll hear in the story, that's the gun that we're waiting to go off, expecting to go off. We'll come back to that as well. I got one more that I want you to look at, one more opening, the new girlfriend. As it said, there's an asterisk there. I'll come back and explain the asterisk in a minute. You know what we did last time, he said. Yes. I wondered if you'd like to do it again. Why not? How about Friday afternoon then? I've got the day off, and Angie always goes to her sister's on Friday. Not always, David. She will this week. You think we could use your car? Angie will take ours. Now, it's less words than we had before, but already, I think most readers already know where this is going, or they anticipate that they know where it's going. When I ask my classes about this, most everybody says they're having an affair and they're going to meet up again. And how long has this affair been going? Now, we've got, and if we go into the next paragraph, just the very next paragraph, which I don't have on the screen, we're going to get the fact that both of them have significant others. Both of them, in fact, are married. And they're sneaking around. And so Ruth Rendell has set it in our mind that this is a sexual affair going on, which is interesting because it's not. It's not what's happening. I don't know if people know this story at all. This one won the Edgar Award. Gosh, I'm trying to think what year it was, but won the Edgar Award. It's a terrifically manipulative story. And what it's about is that David has a secret. And if there's a new girlfriend here, the anticipation is it's going to be the woman here. It's actually David is the new girlfriend. David likes to dress up as a woman, and his wife, Angie, doesn't know this. But Christine, who is a friend of Angie, does. And so they go out and they go shopping. And that's the secret of the story. And that's what sets things in motion. Already, Ruth Rendell is manipulating us to create that ghost plot ahead. and then is going to twist on that. Now, there's an asterisk there. I'll explain that in a minute, as I said. So we're looking at the ways that ghost plots are set up, that Chekhov's gun is laid, that reader expectations are set. And I want to look at conflicts at the prose level. Now, to do this, I want to introduce, some of you may know Michael Cardos. Michael has had a couple of stories recently in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, a terrific writer, and his book, The Art and Craft of Fiction, which is out of print, unfortunately, but you can find it as a used book, is a terrific guide to come back to. And one of the things that I like to talk about there is the elements of scene building. I think most of us, my students, me, the writers I know, don't always think as carefully about how they are building each scene out. We just write. This needs some dialogue. We need to describe something. But it can be something you could think about strategically. And I'm going to look at the way that is used strategically. Dialogue, narration, and by narration, we often think that somebody's just narrating a story. Cardos talks about it as actual stage directions and action that is taken. Description is just what we think of it, but exposition we often think of as backstory. He says that's just information, a line of information only. And then interiority is what's thought or felt. Now I'm going to look at some examples of this. The dialogue in Good Man is Hard to Find is a lot of what motivates this scene. It reveals character. It gets information in there. Does a lot of work. Narration, Bailey didn't look up from his reading, so she wheeled around then and faced the children's mother. It's just an action that's taken. And then we get that mother, a young woman in slacks, whose face is broad and innocent as a cabbage. Look at the energy that we get from that description. And then the exposition, and you could argue that this is interiority. I'm going to say right now that it's just information, flatly told, the author communicating something to the reader directly, the telling instead of the showing. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee. Those elements of scene building can be orchestrated in a nice way for good texture on a scene, but I want to look at the way that they can introduce conflict in a different way. Now, this is the same screen we had before, but I'm telling you what I've done here. I took all of the narration and description and interiority and exposition out of those opening lines and just left dialogue. Now, one of the things that I do with my students at Mason is I have them take an opening to a story and strip it down to just the dialogue, and then add back in narration here, description there, a little bit of exposition, a little bit of interiority, so they can actually mechanically work through how these work. But I want to show you what happens here when we put it back in. She had waited for this for weeks. Yes. She longed to, but she didn't want to sound too keen. Why not? And then the giggle and his laugh. I want you to look at how what we had before is enhanced a little bit by the fact that we have this information. She waited for weeks. You know what we did last time, he said? Yes. Could be read casually. Yes. Why not? All seems casual, but we find out, the reader finds out, that our point of view character here has been anticipating this, has been wanting this, has been waiting for this, and is also trying to modulate her enthusiasm, trying to hide something from David. And I think that that kind of conflict between the elements of scene building adds those levels of tension, which help to keep us on edge as well, us invested in a character. And it's actually these lines of action, not only between Chris and David, but also between what Chris presents to David and what she feels herself, that is the true conflict of the story. And we're going to look at the ending of this story in a little bit to see the way that hinges, and we come back to this. It says here, the interplay between the exposition and the interiority introduces that tension. And then the giggle and the laugh. I love the way this echoes here. And to be honest, I haven't always thought about this when I've talked about it before always tend to discover a text more and more, even small things like this. But the fact of her giggling and his laugh seems to connect them. This is a joint enterprise. But as we find out later, what they want from this relationship is completely different. And it's that veering off from what seems to be connection at the beginning that is the true tragedy and horror of the story. We'll come to that a little bit in a minute. I'm going kind of quickly through this. I know we've got a little bit of a tight time frame. I will take questions later on. I want to talk about the way that endings and beginnings are hooked together. I've got Thrill Me here, which I mentioned before, and I want to look at something that Ben Percy talks about and I'm going to see if I can find the quote here real quick. I've got it here. Talks about with the Bloody Chamber, and particularly Angela Carter's revisionist retelling of the Bluebeard legend. Let me see if I've got a quote here. There we go. A young woman abandons her single mother to marry rich and to escape the poverty of her situation. Things go really, really badly. But in the end, she's saved by her mother coming to the rescue. And this is everything I was going to read. Percy says, astride a horse, wielding her late husband's revolver, firing it into the Marquis's forehead with the same accuracy she used to dispose of a tiger long ago. All of this set up on the first page. With lovely symmetry, the very person our narrator hoped to escape in the beginning saves her in the end. The opening anticipates the ending. Now, the reason I bring this up is because we talked about the first 2 pages. I'm going to look at the way this works with each of the stories we've talked about. Hopefully, whether you know them or not, I'm going to make the point clearly, is that we lay the foundation, we catch the reader's attention, we want them to ask some questions, we want them to anticipate what's going to happen, we want to twist and manipulate those anticipations and expectations for a good ride along the way. And then we want to end with a sense of symmetry of some kind. I think that the stories I admire the most are the ones where you can feel the entire story in the opening pages. And when you reach the end, you're brought back to the beginning, whether actually or just with a sense of resonance, that sense of completed statement somehow. Now, in some of this, it could be, as a good man is hard to find, we're going to meet that misfit. I don't know who drew this picture. I found it online. I wish I could credit it. I wish I could buy it. It's such a great picture. Sadly, the grandmother dies. Spoiler alert there. But they are brought together at the end. The misfit comes at the end. But if anybody's read the story, you know that at the end, it's not just about the misfit's violence. It's about the conversation between the misfit and the grandmother, which is philosophical and religious in ways that I think would surprise anybody who came into the story not knowing where it's going to go. I want to look at the new girlfriend. At the end of it, they end up taking a weekend away. And again, she thinks it's going to be shopping. There's a lot of little moments of tension as the two of them go out as women friends and are actually hit on by men in a bar. But where the real trouble comes is when they go back to the hotel room they're sharing and he comes out of the shower looking very manly. I'm not really like a woman, Chris. I just play at that sometimes for fun. You know that, don't you? The hand that touched her smelt of nail varnish remover. There were hairs on the wrist she'd never noticed before. I'm falling in love with you, he said. And you feel the same, don't you? I'm telling you right now, she does not feel the same. She couldn't speak. He took her by the shoulder. He brought his mouth up to hers and put his arms around her and began kissing her. His skin felt abrasive, and a smell as male as Graham's, her husband's, came off his body. She shook and shuddered. And I'm not going to read the full ending because I do want to preserve a little bit of mystery there. But you can see the way that the expectations at the beginning have now begun to diverge. The whole story in the beginning is playing out at the end in a very different way. They're not laughing and giggling together now. And the fact is, Chekhov's gun doesn't always go off. Reed Johnson's terrific essay also has these lines. Chekhov's actual gun only hangs on the wall for the purpose of making the reader or the viewer believe that it might fire, and then in the most dramatic of fashion failed to do so. And this is the deeper lesson we derive from Chekhov's work. An apparent non-event, a failed moment of transformation, an anticlimax might be just as powerful as the event. This goes back to the idea of what are the reader's expectations? The gun's gotta go off. But does it have to go off? How does not going off help? How does going off surprise? Where are we going to surprise as well as keep the suspense up? I want to look back at Brice Pancake's story a little bit. Now, what happens is as he's going, as our narrator here is going on his snow plowing, he picks up a hitchhiker. And this is the scene at which things really begin to escalate. The boy sits up and starts talking again. It makes me jittery. I was kind of scared about coming through Fayette County, he says. Uh-huh, I say. I try not to brush any cars. Damn, but a lot of hitchhikers get killed up here. A man lays on his horn as he goes past, but I have to get what Mr. Weeks left, and I'm always too close to center. The boy says, that soldier's bones. Jesus, that was creepy. The last car edges by, but my back and shoulders are shaking, and I sweat. That soldier, he says, you know about that? I don't know. They found his duffel bag at the bottom of Lover's Leap. All his grip was in there, and his bones, too. I remember. That was too bad. The snow makes such nice pictures in my headlights, and it rests me to watch them. Now, I want to look at a couple things here, going back to what we talked about before. One is we got the escalation of plot. We got a hitchhiker here. We got that wrench that was really laid heavy on in the beginning. So we know that something bad might happen here. And as he talks about the hitchhiker, suddenly it's beginning to come together for the reader that this man is the killer of these hitchhikers. And so that's plot and that's character. But it's also going back to narration and description and interiority and the fact that as the boy in the seat beside him talks about the hitchhiker, that dialogue and that information, we get something dissonant in his reaction. We don't get our first person narrator responding to what happens, either in dialogue or in interiority, and that enhances the suspense. So at the line level, at the prose level, again, there's a lot of storytelling authority here as those elements of scene conflict with one another. And then that soldier, you know about that? I don't know. Here's dialogue in opposition with one another. And then the information, and then I remember. But then also that move toward the snow, making nice pictures. That is creepy to me. It goes ahead. We come to Gawley, where the road has already been cleared by the other trucks. I pull off, and the line of cars catches up, sloshing by. I grip the wrench. Look under the seat for my flashlight, boy. He bends forward, grabbing under the seat, and his head is turned from me. And this is the climax of the story, of course. This is where Chekhov's gun is not going to go off, as it turns out. I'm way too tired now, and I don't want to clean the seat. I'm going to encourage you to read the full story. This is not the end of the story. This is not the resolution of the story. This is the climax of the story, but there's a lot in the resolution, and there's a lot in the build up to the scenes that I have read, which are going to lengthen out and explore at greater depth what was introduced in the beginning, which is the missing son, the son that ran away, the son that's being looked for, and echoes of the boy that he lost and the boy who's in the car beside him. Again, I'll share these links in a minute. I want to talk about some other resources real quick here, and I want to leave these up on the screen a little bit. I know it's being recorded. I'm glad to provide this PowerPoint for what it's worth for folks to look at. These are some of the texts that I've talked about here, and some other ones that I have found really useful, both in the classes I teach and to my own craft. So I'm going to stop sharing real quick. I went through that lickety split, I know. Let me share a couple of other things. I know that Kate has already shared the first two pages, but there is Bob Mangio's essay, Nick Kolakowski's essay, and the full story for Brice Pancake. Again, 1,700 words. It'll take you not very long to read. Now, I've said all that. What questions do we have?
Actually, I have a question, Art.
Okay.
Um, what do you think is what do you think is the most important thing when you're trying to link the beginning and the ending, that hinge that you talked about? Does it have to be a literal hinge, like an action in the beginning and an action at the end? Can it be like a theme in the
Sure.
beginning, a theme in the end?
I think it can I think it'd be a variety of things. And I think those questions are good ones because it doesn't have to be number one, it doesn't have to be one thing versus another, and it can be more than one thing. Ideally, you've got some thematic echo, but you could also have an action that's repeated or an element that comes back. Um, and and I think that the example that Ben Percy gave about the Angela Carter story is a good one because there is a sense of the daughter trying to escape the mom at the beginning and the mom coming to rescue the daughter at the end. There's an ironic twist there, which I think is really nice. In Bree's pancake story, you've got I don't want to give too much away with that, but you've got it opening with the search for his son and the search for a boy and the hogs. And at the end, without giving too much away, he goes and feeds those hogs, um, which have been talked about, a motif all throughout. And so I think there's an action there, and that action speaks to the larger desires and fears and conflicts that are answered in some way. And I bring that one up because we talk about the beginning and the end, but it's also in that story, at least. And I think this is true of the new girlfriend and of A Good Man Is Hard to Find as well. It's not just that the beginning and end are linked, but rather that we return to these motifs again and again and again. We return to the hogs. We return to the word boy. We return to the drivers in the snow. And those things form this layering of motifs, which are as much a narrative as the plot itself. And I know I'm talking about it in abstractions there, but I think that a really good writer, uh, well, it sounds like not quite what I meant there, but that a writer can build at those couple of different levels. So one of the things I would advise, and this goes back to what you're talking about, Kate, is endings are really hard to get, not only in terms of what's going to happen, but also in the way that it's described. And I've found myself when I'm working on a story and I'm reaching the end and it's just not coming together, that I often go back and reread the beginning to look for words, to look for gestures, to look for words and phrases, gestures, and then look at the conflicts themselves that are introduced, both big and small, and see how that I can address those, return to those, get something kind of circular working on there where the one answers the other, almost like call and response in some way. But that can take a variety of forms. I don't know if I've answered your question at all, and I feel like I'm struggling with the idea of talking in abstractions as opposed to talking in specifics.
No, I mean, I think that's wonderful because I do think that it can often be that we are so focused on a twist, right? We're trying to have that gotcha moment at the end that it's almost not supported unless you're doing all the things that you're describing.
Yeah, yes. And somebody asked about looking the resource. I'll put that back up while we talk. So, but yes, I think it can be really complicated. And we think of a short story, and Kate, you're obviously a terrific short story writer. You know this as well. We're struggling on so many levels to get a lot packed together in a small space, and it's like, well, if I can just get to an ending of any kind at all. But I think the thing that we aim for ideally is to work at those different levels. Edgar Allan Poe and Bonnie and I first bonded over our love for Poe's talk about the single effect in the short story and this ideal that Poe had. Poe is very wordy, of course, but that had that no word was wasted in the telling of a short story. Everything contributed to this overall design. Every word contributed, and I think that part of that is not by stripping away all the words, but rather by enhancing what a story can be about and then having all the words contribute to that. Anyway, I'm rambling again. Is there another question?
I have a question, Jeannie.
Hi, Jeannie. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you.
I'm doing
I,
all
I
right.
actually I actually typed a little thing. The question is predicated on my experience as a book reader.
Okay.
If I don't, if the first paragraph doesn't get me, I kind of I'm not gotten it. I mean, it's basically it. So I wrote a book in 1995.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. I've been writing for 30 years. But this first sentence, if you're willing to hear it, I'm curious because I've always wondered if it's as good as I think it is or if it's BS.
Okay. Now I feel on the spot, but you do too. So go ahead.
I do. Well, yeah, then we're both on the spot. But
Exactly.
there's no gun or anything, right?
That's
Uh,
right.
if I'm such a hot shot psychic, how come I didn't know about the dogs?
I think that's great. I mean, that's my initial reaction. I think that's great because what happens is, and I think this is one of the keys with the idea of the first two pages or the first two paragraphs or the first line, is that you want to plant a question in your reader's mind where they're going to read to the next line to find out what's going on. And I think there's something there that's really good. Now, then the challenge is, though, is that you want to make it where and I'm gonna digress because that's all I do is digress apparently. But you want to have it where you plant a question in the reader's mind that they read the next sentence to find an answer to that.
Mhm.
And then the next sentence beyond that. Now, the trick is, and Lee Child talks about this, of course, is that you want to make somebody wait. As he said, it's a terrific essay. I wish I'd pulled this up, but he said, what was it about? I'm trying to remember the metaphor. He talks about making dinner, and he said that I'm going to screw it up. Never mind. But it talks about like making your family wait for dinner. He said you want to make them hungry. So the trick is how do you? I must screw up the metaphor, but how do you get a reader hungry for something and then hold off that dinner while at the same time not making them feel aggravated about how long it's being held out for. So part of this is pacing. My point is you introduce something and then you hold off the answer to it. But in the meantime, you want to keep them entertained. And I think there's something about that back and forth, that pulling forward and pushing back in pacing that is part of the art of storytelling beyond the first line, which is a terrific first line because I'm hooked and want to find out more. Does that answer the question?
Whoa, yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
Very
So you
grateful.
have that's the start of a book, you said?
It's a novel. It's introducing what Nev March described as a kick-ass lady PI. Her name is
There you
Reggie
go.
Larkspur, and the problem with it is she's a psychic, and John Sandford, Lucas Davenport dips into tarot occasionally to confirm his cops' suspicions.
Mm-hmm.
But selling a book about psychics to an agent, never mind. I mean, I haven't had any success in querying that
Now,
or the sequel, which is an even better book, frankly. So I've written a lot of other stuff because I couldn't stay focused on that. People don't like it or they're not accessible, they're not available for the subject matter. Maybe that'll change in 10 years. I don't know.
uh, yeah, yeah.
Art,
Sounds terrific, though.
I have
Thank you.
another, sorry, I have another question in the chat. I just wanted to get it in from
Okay.
Nancy. How do you feel about time shifts? In other words, a manuscript in which an initial page or two is set after the crime has taken place before returning the reader to the beginning of the story. In essence, maybe that's putting the ending or part of it before the beginning.
Yes, and I'm going to share something real quick about that. Hang on one second. Make sure I got the right thing. Okay, here we go. Martin Edwards did a first two pages essay about his book Mortmain Hall. And this is a novel, and I usually host short story writers, but I had the I was really intrigued by the opening of Martin's book Mortmain Hall, so I made an exception and got a novelist to write. Martin, of course, was the head of the Crime Writers Association, head of the Detection Club, such a well-known, terrific writer, and the greatest authority that I know on anything mystery related. What's interesting about this is his novel starts with the epilogue. That is not a mistake. The epilogue to the story, after everything has been done, and then goes back to the beginning. What I was talking about with Jeannie a little bit is how you're raising questions in the mind of the reader. And I think that kind of time shift, where we are starting at some point, it can raise a variety of questions. How did the characters get to that point? What is going on here that we don't have the background for? And how is the writer going to lead us along and bring us to that point? So I really like that move, and I think that move can be very successful. Now, it is an ambitious move because I think that you've got those challenges I talked about with what Bob Mangio said. You've got to still ground your reader fully in the moment and in the scene of something that they haven't yet gotten the background for, gotten invested in. And so you're trying to work at a whole nother level, with introducing things at the end of a story that is now at the beginning of a story. But I think there's something very dramatic and exciting about that. And I would encourage you to read Martin Edwards' essay. I think this may be the longest of the first 2 pages essays that I've hosted. But listening to Martin talk about craft or reading Martin talk about craft is well worth the investment.
Isn't that kind of like the Columbo effect? Like, didn't
A little bit, yeah. Or
right?
Poker Face. I mean, Poker Face does that, where we back up, and I love that. I think that works really well.
Yeah, it's when it works, it's really fun.
Yeah, yep. The how catch 'em is part of the phrase. There's the why done it, the how catch 'em, and here's another one. My wife's Tara Laskowski. She's a novelist. She writes the who was done in. Her last book was one where we get the victim at the beginning, but we don't know who the victim is until the end. So you get it at the very beginning and then circle back around and find out who it happened to. So a lot of different twists on there. That was not meant to be marketing, but I hope it's, helpful anyway.
Oh, please feel free. Wonderful.
There you go.
Does anyone else have any questions for Art? I've just taken so many notes. It was incredible. I feel like I just took a master class in an hour, which we essentially did. So thank you so much, Art.
I appreciate it. And I'm sorry if I went fast. A lot of times like to have more conversation, but I knew we were on a little bit of a time limit. So I hope I didn't go too fast. I will share the PowerPoint people to look at. Vincent, you had a hand up, I think. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I had an initial question, and you kind of covered it in a number of different ways in your presentation, but I'm always wondering, I'm on my first novel, and I've had this thing where people have critiqued it I've had this idea that the novel is working two functions. It's going to be this novel, standalone at best, but I've also planned a trilogy, so it's the amount of how much information in those first 2 or 3 pages should I tease? And I mean, in a lot of what you said, you kind of gave me direction, and a number of the articles, two of which I'm familiar with. And before I wrote my book, I read Patricia Highsmith's book, so that was very helpful for me. But I'm curious about this because I've gotten these comments like, "Why are you writing this information? More action, more action, more action." And it seems like in your presentation, there's action, but then there's a blind, or there's a distraction. There's something that's there that teases you into the next thing. So that's basically my question. How much is there? I know there's no scientific rule like percentages, but
Yeah.
what are you comfortable with?
It's interesting about and I think it is it's something that I don't always know. I don't think I don't think a writer always knows, where is too much information, where is not enough information until you get, as you said, some feedback from readers who are like, well, why is this here? This slows us down. And then it's a matter of adjusting or answering. The best, I go back to Ruth Rendell. I think she's very much able to envision what a reader is going to think and what's going to work and how to manipulate that reader. I'm not that talented. But then the question is like, well, what does work, and how do you know where to introduce a little bit of information but withhold a little more that you're then gonna divulge later, which I think is your question. Is that right, Vincent? A little bit? Okay. So I'm gonna come back to Highsmith, and the thing that I often do is I go back and look at the writers I admire, the text and then try to emulate some of what's there. I did this. I talked a little bit about that to swim in a pond in the rain, and at the beginning of that book by George Saunders, he looks at Chekhov's In the Cart, and he looks page by page at how there's a twist at the end of the page. Here's an expectation. Here's a twist, and I tried to follow that in writing one of my own stories for Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. We're all strangers here. How do I make this block of text introduce something and then twist the expectation in the next block? Now, I bring this up because some of what you're talking about and the fact that you mentioned Highsmith makes me think a little bit about the opening to The Talented Mr. Ripley, which is one of my own favorite books. And what we've got, if you look at the opening of that, is we've got swift movement from the very beginning. At the beginning of Talented Mr. Ripley, Ripley is in the first line moving away from someone with a sense of danger. And over the course of a chapter, we're going to get a lot of information about him. Vincent, if I think I have a PowerPoint, and I will try to send it to you if I can get your address, which might show the way that first chapter introduces everything, almost everything that is then going to be played out in little bits and pieces over the course of obviously a very long novel, but does it in such a way that you get a gesture as opposed to a full movement, if that works. So part of the challenge is to keep that pacing as you're talking about, to keep that movement going, to keep the action going, and to slip in around the edges little bits of something that then you're going to come back to again and again. That line of action, those lines of action, if you lay those just subtly enough, then you can come back and spend more time on them later once you've got your reader hooked in. So I will try to find I think I have a PowerPoint on that, and I think I can probably illustrate for you what she's doing there in ways that might help you with keeping that pacing forward moving in your chapter
Thank you.
at the same time that you're getting everything done that you want to get done.
Perfect. I appreciate that.
Sure.
So I just want to say thank you. Art, those examples you put up were brilliant. Thank you for showing us. It's so much easier to see what you're saying and understand it when it's right there on the page in front of us. And I mean, I like Kate, I just took a lot of notes. I understand about framing the story, but you broke it down even more than that. And then, laying down the lines of action, that's a nice phrase. But how? It's by showing the relationships, by showing desires revealed and some action. These are all great takeaways. There's so many more. You really packed it in, so thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I hope it wasn't too swift. But I hope people will be able to go back to it at greater leisure and look at it and see some things. So thank you so much.
For sure. Thank you so much, Art. It was really
Thank you so much, Art.
just a pleasure to see you and talk with you today.
Thank you.
Good seeing you, and good luck writing to everybody.
Thank you. This recording is going to be on YouTube, so we will, package it and put it up for our membership. They're all on YouTube, MWA-NY. Thank you again.
Okay. Thank you.